Unit 2, Dimensions of Psychosocial Stress and Coping. 2.1 Introduction. Man, being a social animal, is constantly in an ongoing interaction with his environment. The life of an individual and/or a group of individuals cannot be considered in isolation. One needs to take into account the role of others, life events, and the immediate and distant environment. These life events and environmental factors exert demands on individuals, which evoke responses in them. The responses are governed by the specific situation and are influenced by the resources available to a particular individual. The resources might include intrinsic factors, psychological and physical, and extrinsic factors, other individuals and environmental elements. Additionally, the situation is dynamic and ever-changing. Change is observed both quantitatively, changes in severity or intensity, and qualitatively, varied situations. Thus, the responses need to be modified accordingly. This unit focuses on these aspects: life events and situations, the interaction of the individual with them, and the responses generated. In other words, the issues related to psychosocial stress and coping will be addressed in this unit. Objectives. After studying this unit, you will be able to define stress and describe the concept of stress, describe different theories and models of stress, explain the role of stress in functioning and disease, and gain an overview of stress management. Let me know if you'd like. 2.2 Defining stress. Stress is something that all of us experience throughout our lives. Psychosocial stress, a perceived challenge to well-being, is an indispensable and influential part of life. The nature of stress keeps changing. Let us begin by understanding the concept of stress. 2.1 What is stress? Stress is a commonly used term. It has been used in different contexts with various meanings and studied by multiple disciplines, including psychology, psychiatry, nursing, medicine, sociology, ergonomics, anthropology, pharmacology, physiology, and neurobiology. Stress can be defined as a real or interpreted threat to the physiological or psychological integrity of an individual, resulting in physiological and behavioral responses. It is said that people strive to obtain and protect resources, and stress occurs when there is a threatened or actual loss of resources. Psychologically, stress is a threat, an anticipation of future confrontation with harm based on cues appraised by cognitive processes. Stress can also be viewed as the reaction of people who are under excessive pressures and other types of demands placed on them. Wayne Whiten describes stress as any circumstance that threatens or is perceived to threaten one's well-being and thereby taxes one's coping abilities. It can also be conceptualized as an imbalance between the perception of demand and the perception of the ability to cope with it. 2.2 Stress as event, process, and effect. Stress has been conceptualized in the literature as either a stimulus, the cause, a response, the result, or as a process in itself, combining both stimulus and response. All three of these models have been utilized across various disciplinary approaches, although there has been a tendency to align particular models with specific measurement approaches. Stress thus refers to both an event and the consequences of that event. The term stress subsumes two components. 1. Stressors. Stressful events or situations that have the potential to disrupt an individual's homeostasis. 2. Stress response. The changes that occur in an individual to restore balance and reestablish homeostasis. Stressors can involve either physical or psychological aspects of the external environment or internal factors. The stress response is often referred to as the fight or flight response, in which an alarm is triggered in the brain and the body prepares for defensive action. Interestingly, the stressors do not need to be physically present to elicit a stress response. Sometimes, the mere anticipation of a stressor can trigger it. 2.3 Historical aspects. The initial conceptualization of stress differed significantly from the modern-day understanding. The concept of stress has undergone numerous changes over the centuries. The use of the term stress to represent suffering and adversity dates back to the 15th century. Until the 17th century, stress was synonymous with notions such as hardship, straits, adversity, or affliction. The physiological aspect of stress, or more precisely, the consequent stress response, was first explored by Cannon in the 1920s. Cannon introduced the concept of fight or flight as an adaptive function of human beings and speculated that the physiological processes produced by this reaction were influenced by emotional states. However, the modern understanding of stress began to take shape in the mid-20th century. The first modern notion of stress was proposed by Hans Selye in the 1950s. Lazarus introduced his psychological theory of stress during the same period. Parallel to these works, clinicians observed and proposed the role of life events in the causation and progression of various health conditions. William Harvey in the 17th century and William Osler in the 19th century frequently referred to the relationship between adverse life events and the onset of illnesses. In the early to mid-1800s, Philippe Pinel and Amariah Brigham proposed that the expression of mental illness was affected by societal factors, including life circumstances. Over the years, work in this area has explored newer dimensions, leading to various explanations and models. These include biomedical, psychological, and sociological perspectives on stress, among others. DA 2.3 Theories of Stress. As mentioned earlier, stress has been studied by different disciplines, including psychology, medicine, including psychiatry, and sociology, among others. These disciplines have conceptualized stress in light of their governing principles. 2.3.1 The biomedical perspective. The biomedical perspective emphasizes the adaptive bodily responses to stressors. Selye's general adaptation syndrome, GAS model, based on the physiological response of the body to any demand made upon it, is an example of this perspective. Thus, stress has been seen as a process and event that can be studied in terms of bodily responses like changes in temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, blood cholesterol levels, urinary catecholamine concentrations, corticosteroid levels, blood glucose concentration, etc., in response to stress. The sympathetic adrenomedullary system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical HPA axis are two pathways that govern these bodily responses to stressors. Psychoneuroimmunology and psychoneuroendocrinology are two branches of medicine that deal with the interaction of stress with the immune system and the endocrine system, respectively. Hans Selye introduced the general adaptation syndrome, AS theory of stress. Selye held that, despite change being a normal and inexorable feature of social life, all change is potentially harmful because all change requires adjustment. This early conceptualization of stress implied that stress was a disease of adaptation. Stress in the general adaptation syndrome, GAS model, is characterized by 1. Alarm reaction, where natural resistance is lowered, but body defenses are mobilized. 2. Resistance stage, which leads to increased resistance and adaptation. 3. Exhaustion stage, where the energy for adaptation is exhausted and collapse ensues. The general adaptation syndrome, GAS theory, emphasized the non-specificity of the systemic physiological response to stressors. DAT 2.3.2 The psychological perspective. The role of personality factors and interindividual variance in stress responses is addressed by the psychological perspective on stress. In the stress suppression model, stress exposure mobilizes a resource, which then alleviates stress by affecting its appraisal, responses to the stressor, further stress proliferation, and/or the relationship between stress and ill health. The stress deterrent model portrays resources as causally antecedent to stress. Resources reduce exposure to stress, including stress proliferation, rather than its impact on health. Another model conceptualizes stress and resources as having separate and opposite effects while remaining completely independent of one another. Resources counterbalance the stressor, but do not buffer stress because support operates even in the absence of stress. The Lazarus theory has been the main psychologically oriented theory on stress. According to this theory, two concepts are central to any psychological stress theory. 1. Appraisal, that is, individuals' evaluation of the significance of what is happening for their well-being. 2. Coping, that is, individuals' efforts in thought and action to manage specific demands. Thus, stress is regarded as a relational concept. Stress is not defined as a specific kind of external stimulation, nor a specific pattern of physiological, behavioral, or subjective reactions. Instead, stress is viewed as a relationship, transaction, between individuals and their environment. 2.33 The sociological perspective. Sociological approaches to stress research have tended to focus on analyzing differences in group vulnerability with particular emphasis on gender, class, race, and cultural differences. The sociological perspective attempts to provide an overall understanding of why health inequalities mirror social inequalities in terms of the social distribution of stress. Sociological approaches to stress seek stressors in the organization of lives and in the structure of experience rather than among unrelated risk factors. 2.4 Models of Stress. In this section, we will discuss different models of stress, focusing on emotional and cognitive models of stress. 2.4.1 Emotional and Cognitive Models. Stress has been defined as an emotional tension arising from life events or as a feeling of threat to someone's safety or self-esteem. Lazarus defines stress as a stimulus condition that results in a form of disequilibrium in the system, producing strain and changes within the system. In its broadest sense, stress refers to all physical, psychological, or social phenomena that tax or exceed an organism in such a way that physical, psychological, or social change results. The cognitive view of stress focuses on interruption and subsumes the idea of overload. The basic premise of interruption theory is the well-documented finding that autonomic activity results whenever some organized action or thought process is interrupted. Interruption is the disconfirmation of expectancy or the non-completion of some initiated action. The degree of autonomic activity caused by the interruption of organized processes depends on both the degree of organization of the interrupted process and the severity of the interruption. The gap between the systemic and cognitive viewpoints on stress is bridged by the resource theories of stress. The resource theories of stress are not primarily concerned with factors that create stress, but with resources that preserve well-being in the face of stressful encounters. The social and personal constructs proposed include social support, sense of coherence, hardiness, self-efficacy, and optimism. The conservation of resources, COR, theory assumes that stress occurs in any of three contexts: when people experience a loss of resources, when resources are threatened, or when people invest their resources without subsequent gain. 2.4.2 The stress response. Whenever an individual is faced with stress, it generates a response. This response is a complex combination of multiple components, including emotional, depression, anxiety, anger, rage, physiological, fight, flight, resistance, exhaustion, and behavioral, coping strategies, defense mechanisms, factors. According to Silly's General Adaptation Syndrome, alarm is the first stage. When the threat or stressor is identified or realized, the body's stress response is in a state of alarm. This stage is characterized by the fight or flight response. The stage of alarm is followed by the stage of resistance. To cope with ongoing stress, the body begins to adapt to the strains or demands of the environment. However, there is a limit to the body's ability to resist, and consequently, its resources are gradually depleted. This leads to the third stage of the stress response, which is exhaustion. Once all of the body's resources are eventually depleted and the body is unable to maintain normal function, decompensation may result, leading to exhaustion. 2.3 Newer models of stress. Modern-day studies of stress and stress responses primarily focus on three models: stimulus-based model, also called the objective stress model; response-based model, also called the subjective stress model; and the interactional model. The stimulus-based model of stress, based on the biomedical perspective, emphasizes the central role of life events or traumas. Stress, according to this model, is the sum of biological and psychological stimuli caused by any aggression on an organism. The response-based model, based on the psychological perspective, utilizes chronic stressors as a measurement approach. Stress, in this context, is the response of an organism to a noxious or threatening condition. The interactional model measures day-to-day hassles and is governed by the sociological perspective. The process in which environmental demands tax or exceed the adaptive capacity of an organism results in stress. 2.5 Types of stress. Stress can be classified in different ways. This section discusses the different types of stress. 2.5.1 Classification. Based on the nature of stress. Based on the nature of stress, it can be classified as biological stress or psychological stress. Examples of biological stress include pregnancy, road traffic accidents, etc., while psychological stress refers to frustrations, conflicts, and changes that one suffers. 2.5.2 Classification. Based on the severity of stress. Based on severity, stress can be classified as everyday stress or hassles and exceptional stress. Examples of everyday stress include job stress, relationship problems, etc., while examples of exceptional stress include combat trauma, rape, etc. 2.5.3 Eustress and distress. Contrary to popular belief, stress need not always be bad. In fact, there are two types of stress: good stress and bad stress. Bad stress is referred to as distress, while good stress is known as eustress. Bad stress makes one anxious and irritable, dampening the spirit due to its adverse psychological and physical effects. Eustress, on the other hand, provides stimulation and challenge and is essential for development, growth, and change. Good stress is often associated with motivation. 2.5.4 Classification. Based on the temporal relation of the stress response with the stressor. Stress can also be classified based on the time course of the stress. Stress may be experienced prior to the actual stressful event, during the event, immediately after the event, or after some time has elapsed since the event ended. Charles categorizes stress into four types. 1. Anticipatory stress. Stress caused by concern over the future. 2. Situational stress. Stress occurring in the moment. 3. Chronic stress. Stress that persists over time. 4. Residual stress. Stress related to past events. 2.5.5 Classification. Based on the duration of stress. Based on duration, stress can be classified as either acute stress, short-term, or chronic stress, long-term. Freed's classification. Freed classified stress into three types. 1. Catastrophic stress refers to major disasters affecting a large section of the population. 2. Acute stress results from stressors that require an immediate response. 3. Endemic stress refers to ongoing, continuing stress. 2.5.6 Other types of stress. Cumulative stress refers to the amalgamation of current stressors with previous significant traumas that continue to cause stress. Operant stress refers to a combination of recent and distal life events, as well as chronic stressors that affect an individual at any point in time. Stress proliferation is a sequence of events in which a primary stressor leads to secondary stressors. For example, the loss of a loved one, a life event, may lead to social isolation, a chronic stressor. This revised version corrects 2.6 Stress and health. Now let us discuss the need to study stress and how stress affects the health of an individual. 2.6.1 Why study stress? As explained above, the stress response is the body's usual response to a stressor, which is the individual's way of reacting to an event. This reaction seems to serve an adaptive function as it helps the individual effectively deal with the specific situation and restore the state of homeostasis. However, one might not be fortunate on every occasion. Depending on the severity of the stressor and the individual's resources, the stressor can overwhelm these adaptive resources. Stressors may tax or exceed the adaptive capacity of an organism, resulting in biological and physiological changes that may be detrimental and place the organism at risk for disease. In fact, it has been stated that with sufficient activation, the stress response can become more damaging than the stressor itself. This concept underlies the emergence of many stress-related diseases. 2.6.2 How does stress affect health? The negative health consequences of stress are well documented. The human response to psychosocial stress is directly implicated in hypertension and subsequent vascular diseases. It is also associated with reduced immune function, complicated pregnancies, reduced fertility, gastrointestinal diseases, and psychiatric conditions. For centuries, physicians and patients have recognized the association between adverse life events and illness. The relationship between stress and health started taking a definitive shape in the 1960s. Since then, there has been an increase in interest and evidence of psychosocial determinants of health within the field of public health. Stress has been implicated in several conditions of disrupted physical and psychological health. There are two main pathways through which stress can lead to ill health. The direct pathway, involving its effect on somatic health and disease development, and the indirect pathway, where stress is expressed through health-damaging behaviors. A number of models have been proposed to understand how psychological stress impacts health. These include the cardiovascular reactivity hypothesis and the allostatic load model. According to the cardiovascular reactivity hypothesis, exaggerated cardiovascular responses to stress are markers or mediators of the development of coronary heart disease and essential hypertension. The allostatic load model emphasizes the role of allostasis in maintaining the body's equilibrium. In allostasis, unlike homeostasis, the body does not maintain the same internal state, but rather establishes a new equilibrium after disruption. While the usual turning on and off of these systems is adaptive, overstimulation or malfunctioning of these systems leads to allostatic load. This allostatic load can lead to disease over long periods. 2.63 Effects of stress on physical and mental health. Stress has been implicated in various physical and mental diseases and disorders. This association has been reported with cardiovascular conditions, e.g., atherosclerosis, myocardial infarction, infectious diseases, e.g., herpes simplex, influenza, Coxsackie virus, HIV/AIDS, autoimmune diseases, e.g., rheumatoid arthritis, and cancers. Stress can play a role as a predisposing, precipitating, or propagating factor in these conditions. It could also be responsible for poor treatment responses and relapses. The role of stress in these disorders is mediated through multiple factors. Stress activates the sympathetic nervous system, SNS, and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis, with responses including increased body temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, and plasma glucocorticoid concentration. The well-described effects of the SNS are mediated through alpha and beta adrenergic receptors located on the heart and throughout the vascular system, which include the stimulation of renin secretion and subsequent increase in angiotensin II production. Psychosocial stress increases arterial pressure and has also been linked to chronic renal and cardiovascular diseases, including hypertension. Long-term effects of social challenges on various physiological and behavioral parameters have been reported, mainly involving the daily rhythms of heart rate, body temperature, food intake, and social activity. Stress also alters immune functions and the mediators of the immune response in the body. Almost all psychiatric disorders are related to stress in some way. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, acute stress disorder, adjustment disorders, acute transient psychotic disorder. Here is the corrected version of 2.7 Management of Stress. This section summarizes the methods to study stress and the interventions for stress management. 2.7.1 How to study stress. Every individual is subject to changes in her or his environment. These changes can result from interpersonal relations, situations created by different life events, or the demands life places on us. Moreover, each individual deals with these events and situations in her or his unique way, depending on the situation, appraisal of the situation, and the resources available to manage them. There are three main approaches to the measurement of stress: life events, chronic stressors, and daily hassles or uplifts. Events such as the birth of the first child, divorce, or the death of a significant other are examples of life events. Life events are discrete, acute, observable events that require major behavioral readjustments within a relatively short period and are essentially self-limiting in nature. Life events have traditionally been equated with objective, discrete occurrences that are not the result of an individual's psychological functioning. Chronic stressors are relatively enduring, persistent or recurrent demands, conflicts, threats, or problems that require readjustments over prolonged periods of time. For example, disabling injury or poverty. There are several different types of chronic stressors, including frustration of role expectations and role overload, interpersonal conflicts within role sets, inter-role conflict, role captivity, role restructuring, and ambient stressors. Unlike life events, chronic stressors are seen as subjective and influenced by emotional functioning. Hassles and uplifts are many events that require small behavioral adjustments during the course of the day, for example, traffic jams. 2.7.2 Interventions for stress. Since stress beyond an individual's coping capabilities can be counterproductive, it needs to be managed appropriately. Different approaches have been developed to manage stress. Two primary approaches to stress management are the ecological stress perspective and the stress adaptation perspective. The first of these approaches focuses on changing the environment to better accommodate and reduce stress in individuals across three relevant dimensions: control, uncertainty, and social support. The second approach encourages the individual to adapt to the environment to reduce stress and focuses on three factors: generalized expectancies of control, tolerance for ambiguity, and self-reliance. Cognitive behavioral therapy methods are among the most commonly employed strategies to help individuals deal with stress. Cognitive appraisals of stressful events and the coping efforts related to these appraisals play a major role in determining the stress response. These methods aim to help individuals become more aware of their cognitive appraisals of stressful events, educate them about how these appraisals can influence negative emotional and behavioral responses, reconceptualize their abilities to alter these appraisals, and teach them how to develop and maintain effective cognitive and behavioral stress management skills. Stress management training, self-observation, cognitive restructuring, relaxation training, time management skills, and problem-solving skills have been used effectively in the management of stress. 2. Let us sum up. Stress is a universal phenomenon that impacts everyone throughout their lives. It is described as a perceived challenge to well-being and can be viewed as a stimulus, cause, a response, effect, or a process, a combination of cause and effect. Stress can be understood from biomedical, psychological, and sociological perspectives, with various models complementing each other for a comprehensive understanding. It significantly impacts physical and psychological health, necessitating the study of effective management techniques. Cognitive and behavioral approaches are effective for managing stress and mitigating its adverse effects. Glossary: cumulative stress, a mix of current stressors with past traumas that persist as stress sources. Eustress: positive stress that stimulates growth and change. Operant stress: the combined impact of recent and long-term stressors at a given time. Stress: a real or perceived threat to an individual's well-being, leading to physiological and behavioral responses. Stress response: the unique emotional, physiological, and cognitive reactions of an individual to a stressful situation. Answers to check your progress exercises. Exercise 1. 1. Stress can be defined as a real or perceived threat to the physiological or psychological integrity of an individual, resulting in physiological and behavioral responses. Exercise 2. 1. Theories of stress include the biomedical perspective, the sociological perspective, the psychological perspective. 2. Models of stress: emotional and cognitive model, stress response model, stimulus-based model, objective stress model, response-based model, subjective stress model, interactional model. Exercise 3. 1. Stress classifications, based on nature, biological or psychological, based on severity, eustress or distress, based on duration, short-term or long-term, based on temporal relation, timing of the stress response. Exercise 4. 1. Stress interventions, cognitive behavioral approaches, stress management training, self-observation, cognitive restructuring, relaxation training, time management skills, problem-solving skills. Unit N questions. Explain what you mean by stress. Name the theories of stress. Discuss any one in detail. Stress is a real or interpreted threat to well-being that triggers physiological and behavioral responses. Theories of stress include the biomedical, sociological, and psychological perspectives. For example, the biomedical perspective focuses on how stress affects the body, emphasizing physiological responses like hormonal changes and their impacts on health. 2. What are the models of stress? Explain at least 2 in your own words. Stimulus-based model views stress as an external event or situation that challenges an individual's well-being. Response-based model defines stress as the individual's reaction, such as emotional or physiological responses, to a stressful situation. 3. Explain briefly how stress affects the physical and mental health of individuals. Stress can lead to physical health issues such as headaches, high blood pressure, heart disease, and a weakened immune system. Psychologically, it can cause anxiety, depression, irritability, and difficulty concentrating. 4. Describe stress management in your own words. Stress management involves recognizing stressors, adopting cognitive and behavioral techniques like relaxation exercises, time management, problem solving, and cognitive restructuring to reduce stress. Developing a balanced lifestyle and self-care routines is also crucial for managing stress effectively.